Five, four, three, two, one.
Hello, willkommen, bienvenue, konnichiwa, ni hao, jambo, marhaba. It's time for the Armist Inquisition yet again, episode 224 on Sunday, the 20th of March. I'm Amish Phil.
I'm Amish Ben.
And I'm Amish Matt.
The dwarf.
Ronnie Pickering!
And the mother of madness.
Who the fuck's that?
Yeah, me!
And we've got a special guest on the line, a fellow Englishman, an expat from over the pond, Marc Malone. How you doing, Mark?
Good to be with you, chaps. Doing well. It's in the afternoon here, which is good. I don't do Sunday night streams anymore. I did a couple of those and sound like a crackhead on a come down. So this is good. Good timing.
What time is it there? It's about 2 o'clock.
It's supposed to be, but I forgot our clocks went forward and yours haven't. So it's actually 3. Yeah, so we're only 5 hours difference. So you're in the future. You can tell me what's going to happen with government tyranny next.
That's why you're here, Mark, to educate us. Now then, by way of introduction, maybe you should give us a bit of your background and what you're doing with America21stcentury.com and how you got into this and how fucked we are and all that sort of stuff. Yeah,
fucked short term, but optimistic long term. We can get into that.
Like that.
So, a little about my background. So, studied philosophy of science at Oxford. Philosophy of science basically looks at the scientific methods, what underpins the disciplines that people look at. So in this case, you have physics, biology, chemistry, etc. And of course, within those, you have tons of subcategories. Within biology, you have medicine. And then within medicine, you have ophthalmology or whatever. So philosophy of science looks at the methods. So the actual core of science. After all, science isn't an institution, it is a method, but it isn't really a method. It is actually a series of methods. Often those series of methods actually compete. And this is really, really important now. Like people like me and those that are more qualified than me, those that are actual PhDs and stuff, which I'm definitely not, but there are guys in this discipline who could never have been more needed than the last 2 years. And yet people pretend like this discipline doesn't exist. There's a reason for that. Because they want people to believe that only one scientific method exists when actually there are several. And we can talk a bit about that as well. So that's what philosophy of science is. I've also worked in data science and behavior analysis and linguistic analysis in the corporate world and in academia. But I've also been a musician. I taught, in fact, I actually blew off university. I was supposed to go into physics, but I kind of just blew off university and toured in a band for like 7 years. So I'm not in any way like an academic guy at the core. I just, I understand that those skills are necessary for the work that I have to do. And that work at the moment is America 21, which is essentially to withdraw America from globalist treaties, in particular United Nations Agenda 21 2030, which is what the Great Reset actually is. And we can get into what those differentials are because it's actually really important. And a lot of people are fighting the Great Reset, which is important, but the Great Reset is a phantom. It's a little bit like fighting a think tank. It's a little bit like fighting an ideology. It's like, okay, we're going to fight communism. And it's like, great, but communism is an intangible thing. So really what you would want to do if you wanted to fight communism is you would say, I'm going to put certain political blocks on people being able to steal half my wealth, for example. That's tangibly fighting communism, not just like I'm going to fight the ideology. The Great Reset's very similar. We have to be very, very pragmatic about this. We can't fight the Great Reset as an idea. The political implementation is actually through United Nations Agenda 2030. That is actually what we should be fighting. And that's real, and that is implemented in your city.
Wow. That was something I wanted to ask you about our mate Klaus Schwab, because I hear differing opinions about his role, and I wanted to get your take on him. Is he this sort of global tyrant that people make out, or is he an ineffectual wannabe, a front man, a nothing guy?
Yeah, so there's a hierarchy. It's both. He's a front man for people far more powerful than him, but he certainly has more power than a lot of people you will see at the front. So the hierarchy could loosely go like this. You could imagine your prime minister or president, and then above that, you would have your chief medical person, maybe like a Fauci. Fauci would be, in this instance, more powerful than Biden. But then above him, you have Bill Gates. And then above him, you would have Klaus Schwab. And then above Klaus Schwab, you would have David Rockefeller. And then above David Rockefeller, you would have perhaps Evelyn Rothschild or something. So there's a hierarchy. And in this hierarchy, depending on where you are, there's more power, of course, as you gravitate up. But old Klaus certainly has enough clout to do a lot of damage. That's for sure. Because the World Economic Forum is essentially all of the world's tech entrepreneurs, basically just all the rich people in one spot, negotiating with each other how they're going to transform the world. So it's just like, you have a group get together. Well, he is the chairman of that group get together. And many of them look up to him. So if he's going to say, we're going towards this direction, in this case, the fourth industrial revolution, transhumanism, many of them are going to follow. And many of these people run Microsoft and run Facebook and Google and BlackRock and Vanguard as well. So yes, he has a lot of clout, but at the end of the day, he was trained, his mentor was Henry Kissinger, and Henry Kissinger was David Rockefeller. So there's always the same hierarchy in place. It's always Rockefeller will show up no matter where you look when it comes to this agenda.
I guess what a lot of people don't realize is that with someone like Klaus, it's not that he has direct power like a politician, someone who writes laws, but he has power in the way he can influence the agenda and the path forward and the vision, if you like. And that's where he's more influential than powerful. Been probably more accurate, would you agree?
Yeah, for sure. And that's an interesting point. I used to be very libertarian. I used to be sort of like, look, if we can I want government reduced to basically nothing, so they just don't interfere with our lives. And as I have matured in my thinking on this and looked at how this global operation actually works, I realized that that's actually quite dangerous. And the reason is because as we shrink our national sovereignty and our national institutions, what happens is these people like Klaus Schwab and the corporate oligarchs, they come in and they assume the vacuum of the space. So then what we think we're doing is we go, okay, government bad, which it is. I mean, that's inarguable. But then what happens is they just assume the vacuum, and someone is always going to take the vacuum of power. So then our job is to think, who is going to be the best person? Because Mexico is a great example of this. People say, well, the government doesn't have much power. No, the cartels assume the vacuum of power that the government doesn't have. Right. Someone is always going to take the vacuum. And what has happened in Western society, we rightly pushed for individual liberty, which was good. But in that process, these corporate oligarchs and the likes of Klaus Schwab and all of the other mentions, they come in and they take the influence then. And that influence, so for example, in this case, Google censors more than the government censor. Well, that's an example of the nation states, the institution not putting the correct block on, an outside influence coming in and assuming that power. Now, of course, they work in tandem, they work together. But the difference is we do have some influence in the national institution, whether that's Westminster or DC or whatever. You have no influence at all in the corporate institution. So we have to just, I guess, play it smart and think pragmatically, where's our best bet going to be? And where our best bet is going to be is we have to take back the institutions we do have franchise in. And in this case, that is national institutions.
It's a conundrum, that, isn't it? The mix between government and private entities, because you can see, I mean, the cartels, it sounds like an extreme example that you would have, because we think of, in our pampered Western lives, we think as the state as having the monopoly on violence. But that wouldn't necessarily be the case. You know, if we did shrink the state down that much, would these big corporate entities, you know, if there's no state oversight preventing Google, for example, for creating its own army, then why wouldn't they? Right. Why wouldn't they?
Yeah.
Yeah, because I guess I'm from a similar sort of mindset where I've had this same sort of quandary, and I was very, I don't know if extreme libertarian is probably the right phrase, but the same sort of thinking that, you know, I just want to be left alone. I just don't want to hear from the government at all. Stay out of my life. But you do come to a point where you realise they are necessary for certain things, and there is a certain balance of power that is required. And I think you gain more insight from this from reading history as well, because you do see through different periods of history where extremes in the social fabric, if you like, or the social contract have emerged, and it never tends to end very well.
Yeah, well, and this is, it's so, you know, it's not an either or, right? Like we can have national institutions, let's just say for argument's sake that is a government in this case, but it doesn't have to be the incarnation that it is now, and likewise it doesn't have to be the extreme incarnation in either direction. It just needs to be something that we actually have a stake in. And of course, the problem is that we really do not have a stake in corporate oligarchy. We do not have a stake in the World Economic Forum or the World Health Organization or even the United Nations and the European Union and any of these supranational organizations. Of course, is why the United Kingdom left the European Union. I voted for that because despite the fact that I understand that was not a solution to many of Britain's problems, I'm always going to want to secede from supranational power in any form. World Health Organization, whatever. The whole idea is we already have governing bodies at the nation level to look like the FDA or the NHS to do quality control. We don't need someone above them doing the quality control as well. This is where things have gotten really messy. So I don't think it has to be an either or, but I think as it comes to this great reset problem, the problem that we have now of 2030 being the timeline for a total transformation of society, our issue is time, which we don't have much of, especially with the fact that this is expediting all of the time, and the cause and effect issue of the last 2 years is going to transform things so much more economically and everything else. And we can talk about that. Yeah. So then with the little time we have and the little influence that you have, you really only have a couple of choices, which is either leverage the stake you do have, which is your city government, your MP. And there are ways that we can do this to fight the New World Order, and we can talk about that. There's a very real way you can use this. But if you don't use that, the only other option is to get everyone to boycott all of these corporations, which is very, very difficult to do, or a revolution. And the problem with revolutions, of course, is, like you said, they can turn out much worse. Bolshevik revolution was far worse than the Russia that came before it. And French Revolution, I would argue, actually the same problem. So what do we do?
Well, some people are suggesting a parallel system, aren't they? It's something I've been hearing online, in that that is another option, is to just opt out and to try and set up your own networks, be self-sufficient if you can, and try and instigate some sort of parallel system. But obviously there are drawbacks. Who's the guy we talked to who was the Nigel Howitt?
Yeah,
he was going down that line, wasn't he?
He was trying his best.
Yeah, he was self-sufficient on his land. He had an exit strategy for when things really kicked off. He wouldn't tell us which country it was.
No,
I said Mexico and he smiled, so I think it might be Mexico. But yeah, what do you think about setting up parallel systems and networks to help us? Is that a goer or not?
Yeah, no, I totally support that. I don't think that I don't think that should be the only thing we do. So I support any good moves towards pushing people into self-sufficiency and sovereignty. The parallel system idea is actually in line with what we're doing. What we're doing, though, is just an institutional, I guess, a meta level view on that same move. So yes, I support that. Self-sufficiency is important, as well as just pulling some of the power from these corporate oligarchs. Get milk from your local farmer. I do this. I buy half a cow from the local farmer, and that's my beef for the whole year. So I go down, get half a cow, throw it in the freezer. That's it. I have my beef from someone local. Therefore, if I get banned from the supermarket, well, I can just eat beef every day. I'm totally fine. So I do support that. I do support growing food if you can. All of those things, yeah. But we also have to think about where does that take us in the long run? Let's say there's only 5% of us that do that. I have children. I have 3 children. And I want them to have a society the way that we had grown up. I want them to have, I want them to be able to go out for a pint rather than having to, brew it for 3 years in the back garden and then drink it in the garden. I'd like them to actually experience society and have even just half the freedom we had growing up. So then I think, and then people might say, well, that's impossible, but it isn't. If we think about social dynamics, most people follow based on incentives. So if we think about political incentives and the stuff that we're fighting politically, people think, oh, well, most are just never going to go along with it. No, actually, that's the total opposite of the truth. Most just go along with anything. Whatever the thing is, they're just going to go along with it. Whether it is climate change, whether it is the end of climate change, whether it is COVID, whether it's the end of COVID, they're just going to go along. That's the social dynamic. Most people are just going to head where the power takes them. So then our choice is to go, are you going to let immoral power take them, or are you going to let moral power take them? Because again, the vacuum, someone is going to take them. Someone is going to funnel them in a direction. And you have the choice of us doing it, or you have the choice of the satanic elite doing it, but someone is going to do it. So my proposition is most of them are going to follow us, which they will, once we just start making enough progress for them to see the proof of concept, right? Once they start seeing, okay, so we can get into some specific examples about this, of what we're doing. But let's just take one example. Okay, we've removed some of this United Nations Globalist Treaty out. Now we can produce our own oil again, produce our own energy. The bills are much cheaper. Your fuel is much cheaper. The economy in the state that we've done that in is much better. Of course, they're going to follow us through the rest of the journey as we continue to withdraw from globalism. Well, you just take that out to Western civilization as a whole, take what we're doing in Montana and widen it out to the entire society. People will follow you, of course, because they just follow the institutions of power. And it's our job then to make sure that we take it back and put it in a moral direction. Otherwise, what happens is the parallel system we have will be all our children have of their society left. And, if we think about our ancestors who went through hell to build the things that we have, just think about, like, England's a great example of this. You have pubs that are 1,200 years old. You have cathedrals that are like 1,500 years old. You have all this beautiful history. Do you really want to give that to them? Like, that's not theirs to take. So we have a choice. Take back the institution and people will follow. They'll follow any direction, or give it back, or let them take it. And there goes 2,000 years of history, So we can do this. I'm working on the formula right now, which we can talk about if you want.
Can you explain why they want our pubs? I'm a little naive.
They actually do, funny enough, but it's not so much, unfortunately, they don't want the pub. They just want to destroy our culture. The whole point is just to destroy Western civilization's culture. So they started with the church. It doesn't matter if you're religious or not. It's not about that. It's a foundation of Western civilization, whether you like it or not. There's a lot of people that don't like drinking, but the pub is still a foundation of especially the Anglo aspect, or the Celtic Anglo aspect. So there are these institutions, the cathedrals, there are these monuments, there are these historical relics that are deeply ingrained as who we are. They don't really care what the thing is, whether it is a cathedral or a pub or whatever, pick your thing. They just want the thing removed so they can start afresh, right? You can see this in the communist uprisings are the best example of this throughout history. Mao, in The Great Leap Forward, wiped all Chinese history. And they have a very rich history too. They have thousands of years of very rich history that was totally wiped. Now, I have a friend in China who's very influential, powerful businessman. He's worth about $500 million. And he says they don't know anything about Chinese history. People in the West know more about Chinese history than people in China because Mao wiped it all when he came in. That's what they're doing to us. So the relic itself isn't really what's important. It's just an erosion of the culture so they can start afresh, a reset, right? So then our job is, again, like the people follow the incentives. You set up the incentives in a certain way, people will follow it. This is how the whole COVID thing, the whole conspiracy works from day one. There are very few people involved in the actual conspiracy. You just set up the boundary conditions. Like, let's say you set up the conditions. This is the Overton window. These are the parameters. And then people will follow the incentives, those parameters, set up. You don't need a conspiracy. The example, COVID, $11,000 if you die with pneumonia on a ventilator, $39,000 if you die with COVID pneumonia on a ventilator. So no doctor or nurse needed to be in on what COVID-19 was really about. All they needed to do was set up the parameters, and the incentives will drive people in the correct direction. So really you have 0.0000001% of people actually doing a conspiracy. Everyone else is following incentives, and that's those parameters. But we can use that to our advantage too. And Montana is showing that where we're doing political work. They just rejected the oil ban on Joe Biden's green nonsense. Well, now they're going to be producing their own oil, and they're not going to experience the crisis everyone else is experiencing. And then what happens is, rather than people then going in the power direction that way, they're going the other way, and they go in our way. And then we start to get more sovereignty and more self-sufficiency. So this sort of people following isn't a bad thing if you have the correct people leading. It's just a bad thing because they're following the incorrect people right now.
I think you have an advantage in the States because of the way that powers are separated and states' rights and stuff, which we are lacking in the UK. And my concern is that most of the people at the top who actually run the UK are captured anyway.
Right. Well, it's the same in America.
Yeah. But isn't that more of a local, your state governor is answerable to the population of that state? Is it not easier to get things done and get things rolling, and then one state can see, like with marijuana legalization, one state will try it, they'll say, oh, fucking hell, we're taking in so many extra million of tax revenue, maybe we should try that, and it can spread like a virus across the country, Whereas we don't have that. Our country is run by London. It's London centric. We talk about the London bubble all the time. And, they make fine words about what they're going to do with the North, don't they? Us filthy fuckers up here.
Northern powerhouse. Yeah,
but nothing ever materializes.
Yeah, well, it is definitely, the constitutional system definitely makes it a little bit easier because it essentially, outside of the Bill of Rights, outside of the Constitution itself, which is, right to free speech, right, self-defense, bear arms, etc. Outside of those core things, the states can do whatever they want. So the national government's purpose was supposed to just be to protect those core fundamental rights. Everything outside of that, the states are supposed to be able to go whichever way they want. Like marijuana doesn't interfere with the Bill of Rights. So therefore, if you want to do it, go ahead. If you don't, right? And that's supposed to be the system. So in that perspective, it definitely helps. But like the United Kingdom, like everywhere, America has, of course, become increasingly centralized as each year has gone on. So this sort of state sovereignty thing has really only seen a real comeback in the last couple of years, since COVID, really. That is the benefit to, and again, that's why there is a benefit to where this situation is going, because it is forcing people to become more sovereign at both the individual and the state level. So in this case, governors and their people just rejecting the World Health Organization or the CDC's guidelines. And like I said, I'm in South Dakota, never had a lockdown, never had a COVID mandate of any kind. Pretty much the only place in the world that never did. And nothing has ever happened here because the people were just like, no, I'm not doing that. So the governor was like, all right, that's it. Can't get people to do it. So we're just not going to do any lockdowns. It is easier here. But the reality is that it's, again, the city government level that you guys have that really exists in all Anglosphere nations is much the same. And what I mean is that the United Nations Agenda 2030 attacks the city level. So they have a treaty, which is to radically transform the world by 2030 for, quote, climate change. And then that is actually signed at your city level, your city government and your mayor and your sometimes MP, but mostly the city government and the mayor will sign that into law. So then what will essentially happen by 2030 globally is the cities will become kind of like city-states of the global empire, of global governance. So you can imagine like Birmingham, where I'm from originally, or Manchester or whatever, these will be essentially city-states of global governance, which is actually what the Roman Empire did. The Roman Empire was a city-state empire across Europe. It wasn't conquering nations as such. It set city-states up to be subjugated to Rome. So it's a very similar system to that. So in this case, Los Angeles would be a city-state. It's called SoCal, and that would be under the United Nations jurisdiction. So it kind of this whole global governance plan basically bypasses the nation state and goes straight to your kind of county level. The bad news with that, of course, it means is it destroys the cohesion of the nation, which goes back to what we were just saying about the removal of all these traditions. That's what it's all about. It's purposefully to remove the cohesion. But the good news about that is you can actually do something about that, because if you can cut this at the city level, your county level, you've freed yourself from the New World Order. You won't actually be absorbed in. So even if the next city is, yours won't be. And then you still have control over the affairs of your city without having to withdraw into the forest. But you can always have the forest as a backup, set it up just to be sure. But why not just obviously remove it from the city? So that's what we're doing here. That's the process we're taking. And we're actually starting with banning the social credit system, ESG. I don't know if you guys have heard of ESG before.
That's I've got like 4 things written down here, and the second one is ESG. So yeah, good. Explain ESG to us for whoever's not familiar.
Yeah, so basically my organization's project is beginning with that. We have like a list. It might be the 4 things you have. We have a list of things that we're going after. That the primary one being sustainable development, but it's also carbon neutral. It's also public-private partnerships, and it's ESG. These are like the 4 tenets of the Great Reset of the New World Order. Now, the reason we're going for ESG first is because that is partly because it's very urgent, but also it's an easier thing for us to ban. So we're going to ban it in Montana at the state level, and then we're going to take that bill and we're going to replicate it across the country, and hopefully we can export it and replicate it across the world. The rest of the Anglosphere in particular. So ESG, environmental social governance, basically works as you have the World Economic Forum passes this term on, which is actually comes from the United Nations Agenda 21 and 2030. Environmental social governance basically means that the economics, business, the private sector, and the government sector will work to these 3 tenets. So environmental being the obvious. If a company isn't environmentally friendly, isn't sourcing their products environmentally friendly, they will get penalized for that. Social being if you don't have enough.
Mark, that sounds good though. That sounds good. What's wrong with penalising companies that dump toxic waste into rivers? Because this is part of the problem, is that on the face of it, most of these things sound like a great idea.
Right. Well,
you have to play out.
Preach.
Yeah, preach. You have to play out what you have to explain why. How can this be misused? I guess.
Yeah, well, the thing is that if it was just toxic waste, of course, that would be fantastic. We'd all support that. And the unfortunate thing is that isn't really what it's about. So environmental, if we really go through what that really means, and we go back to sustainable development, it essentially means anything that produces carbon dioxide.
Oh, like us, because we produce carbon dioxide.
Humans,
Whoops.
You produce it, right?
Yeah.
But farming, cars, manufacturing, anything a nation needs to be sovereign. You need to produce your own shit. You need to produce your own food. You need to use your own energy. So food, manufacturing, energy. Those are the 3 things that produce most carbon dioxide that you need to use every day. So then suddenly now goes back to that sovereignty issue. Everything you now produce in your nation to get by, to be sovereign, is going to be decimated because it's not environmentally friendly, because it doesn't meet the criteria of carbon dioxide. If it was just toxic waste, that would be fantastic. So then what ends up happening, of course, is certain companies will get rated up, some will get rated down, even though the ones that get rated down are actually essential for survival, and the ones that get rated up are mostly just garbage you don't need. So that's one aspect, but there is a deeper investment thing, which we'll get to in a second. Social is like LGBT or Black Lives Matter or whatever. So if you don't have enough gay people working at your company or enough black people, whatever, you lose marks for that. And then the final one being governance is the most pernicious of all, because that is actually what global governance is. Again, goes back to not government, but governance. Governance undercuts government. So then the New World Order system is nothing to do with government, it's governance. And that's why ESG is environmental social governance. It undercuts government completely.
That's such an important distinction, because government is people. There are people who you can wring by the neck. Governance is like going back to the philosophy of science. Governance is a method. It's an action. It's not a man or a woman that you can kick out. It's a process. This is such
Very
a massive
important.
distinction.
Very important thing you just said there. Actually, that's very important. That it is governance is just a thing that's happening. It isn't an institution, which means that anyone can be governing you. Could be a cartel. Could be Klaus Schwab. Could be BlackRock. Could be all three.
Could be me.
It could be you.
I think you probably have more chance of getting voted in than them giving you a seat at the table. But and I mean that with love, because they don't give any of us a seat at the table. So, environmental social governance. So that's the thing. But so if we go though to how that practically works, this is how it practically works. BlackRock and Vanguard, of course, the two biggest sort of asset investment firms in the world, that have a shared GDP, I think, of around 25 trillion, probably closer to 30 trillion, which is like the European Union plus like all the Anglosphere minus America's GDP. So talking insane levels of wealth.
Whoa, hang on. Just repeat that. The combined wealth of BlackRock and Vanguard is equivalent to?
Would be the GDP of the European Union and the Anglosphere minus America. So Canada, Australia, UK, etc., and the European Union. So that's pretty much that's roughly how much money those two companies have, right? So now if we think about the assets they manage too, most of their shareholders, of course, are shareholders in many of the other big organizations, many of the other big corporations. So then they have all this sort of proxy power that isn't even necessarily directly linked to their assets that they technically hold. Now, why this is important is because BlackRock are one of the spearheads of ESG. So what this basically means is if you want investment, let's say you run a business in a major city, could be London, could be Chicago, doesn't matter. Well, they're going to base you on sustainability points. They're going to base you on your socially liberal points. They're going to base you on all sorts of points that have nothing to do with whether your business is good or not, or whether it provides the service that people need or not. It's going to be based on all these metrics that they have got from the World Economic Forum, which comes from United Nations Agenda 21, which comes from the Rockefeller Foundation. And that's the hierarchy. So that's how this whole conspiracy works from top to bottom. Now, what we're going to begin doing is we're going to start by banning ESG and making that illegal in the state of Montana. And once we've done that, BlackRock and Vanguard will be sapped of much of the power that they use to control the investment. So that, therefore, they can't penalize a farmer or a manufacturing company or someone that does a job that we actually need. The most important one for our times being energy, being oil. So now if we can export that across the country, which we will be able to, probably at least across all the red states. So let's say we have half of America, we can export that then to Canada and Australia and England. We suddenly now have taken a huge beating to them just by banning the social credit system itself, because ESG is the beginning of the social credit system, right? Because after the level we're talking about now, which is business and the private public sector, it will come down to you at the individual level. You will then be, judged by the same metric that the businesses are now being judged. What's your social group like? What's your behavior like? What are your interests? So that's what the social credit system is. It would be based on essentially the same system, which is sustainability. And that's why they were always going to go to climate change in the end. COVID-19 is, I do believe they will have a pandemic too. Bill Gates said so, but the sustainability is always going to be the final thing for them. It's always the main end game, because viruses and wars still limit how much you can control someone at an individual level. You can control society as much, but not an individual. Whereas sustainability, there's no limit. They can control how much water you consume, how many times you flush the toilet, how many times you've taken a shower, who you communicate with, where you drive, if you even have a car, if you travel, if you're allowed to travel, what type of food you eat, what type of content you consume, anything. Because sustainability, everything produces carbon, including you. So that's why in the end, climate change is always going to be what they go to. And it's always going to be sustainability that the social credit system is. So if we can ban ESG, we might be able to stop the social credit system entirely, because there's really nowhere for them to go past that point. So it's really exciting times. And I have a state senator, several congressmen, 3 city governments, and a few legislators on my side already in just 8 months.
There was a report from a think tank came out, I don't know if it was today or yesterday in the UK, suggesting no car Sundays. which is something
Right.
that the Dutch implemented in the 70s on the short term for maybe 6 months. But this is seriously being discussed now for the UK.
Well, shops used to be closed, didn't they, on Sundays? If they close them again, there'd be less people driving to Aldi, wouldn't there?
How are we going to do the podcast? You gonna walk it from your house?
I'll zoom in.
You can't
Yeah,
let
it's
these
crazy.
things take hold,
No, if they do,
unfortunately.
they do it on a Saturday.
Yeah.
Or, go to your local town square and say, I'm not putting up with this shit.
It all seems like a massive effort just to get rid of some pubs. I still don't get it.
Yeah. Pubs are an important part of culture, especially in England.
Yeah.
People will fight for their pubs, for sure. No, unfortunately, not as much as they should have over the last couple of years. Well, the cars, it's all about autonomy. This is why the Soviet Union largely didn't like automobiles anyway, even though they produced a lot. Because it's like, there's nothing that kind of screams autonomy more than the car. Like, I'm just going to get in, and I'm just going to go wherever I want to go. I don't have to rely on someone else's time, someone else's destination. So there is, of course, it isn't really anything to do with carbon dioxide. None of this is, the climate's changing naturally. It has nothing to do with carbon dioxide. It is changing. It just is nothing to do with carbon dioxide is the point. So cars, though, it's all about autonomy. They just don't want you to be able to travel. They just don't want you to be able to have the control of going where you want to go. And that's ultimately what the whole thing is always about. All of it is about that, really. So definitely fight for the cars. That's a very important one. And the easiest way to do that, because the car removal is Agenda 2030. So the only way really to save the cars in Britain is to gut out 2030, which begins at your city council.
And something that I've been seeing more and more in national press and local press is the concept of 15-minute cities, which plays into this, and that we'll all give up our cars, and the cities of the future will be constructed in a way that all your amenities will be in 15 minutes walk or 15 minutes of public transport, which, you can use at, whoever runs the public transport's leisure if they determine you're fit to travel. And
That's another thing that sounds delightful.
Yeah, well, the design of the cities, this goes back to Agenda 21, which was 1992. Agenda 2030 was 2015. I probably should explain this at the beginning, but just as a quick summary, Agenda 21 is 21st century agenda, and Agenda 2030 is the milestone that they want to achieve most of that, which is 2030. So they're not separate. 2030 is 2021 is long term, and 2030 is here's when we want to have most of this achieved. And they've kind of got a subcategory of goals.
I thought they were just late, because I'd heard of Agenda 21 and then Agenda 2030. I thought they just pushed it back, and I thought, these guys are just going to push it back even more. Agenda 30,
yeah.
60.
Well, I hear this a lot, because a lot of guys in the movement, if we can call it a movement, I suppose, a lot of guys will say, they do fail because they failed with 21. They have to push to 2030. I'm like, no, they didn't. 21 is the 21st century. They didn't fail at all. 2030 is just a milestone, so they want to achieve most of that by. But the real end of 21 is 2050. That's when the 21st century plan is supposed to end. So what we're supposed to see by 2030 is the obviously the transformation of society, which we're already far along in just in 2 years. But by 2050, you're supposed to see the end of nations, the end of civilization. It would be completely nothing like it's ever been. No nations, nothing.
Demolition
But by 2030, well, it's funny enough though, on this one, the 21 stuff talked about what you were just saying, God, in the early 90s, right? This idea of that city centers would be, you wouldn't really leave the city center. So you talked about this 15-minute city. Well, yeah, that's in the original document. This idea of self-driving cars would keep you within a 5-mile radius of the city. So therefore, that's why they're pro Tesla and electric cars, and not pro actual cars, because again, you don't have the autonomy. They can just switch off the computer, as they said they would do with Russian electric cars, right? So they already say, hey, let's shut off the electric cars in Russia if they can't drive them anymore. That's your future on this trajectory. So, you say the wrong thing, cars shut off, computers shut off, bank accounts
or even
shut off.
run you into a lamppost if they really don't like you.
Yeah, right. So in this one, that's the 15-minute city. It's just like keep you locked into that environment. And their justification again, of course, is climate change. Yeah. We don't want you going into nature and fucking it all up because you've destroyed it enough already. which translates to in real language as we want to control the water and the food production, so we just don't want you going out there. We need you to stay in the city and be a good slave.
We played a clip of Bojo the Clown, Boris Johnson, our dear leader, at the last Conservative Party conference, where he was using the term rewilding, which is a concept that us in the Red Pill Brigade are familiar with. Maybe this is part of the issue as well, isn't it?
That is Agenda 21, yeah. That rewilding was used like 30 years ago. It's amazing that they're coming out with the stuff like decades later and people like, oh, that's just a conspiracy theory. And I'm like, I mean, they're literally saying the same stuff that's in the document. And then when you show them the document, they go, oh, that Agenda 21, oh, that's a good thing. So, and that's usually a process. Yeah, rewilding basically just means the sort of the removal of people from rural lands into these kind of city urban environments, and the rewilding of the urban environment. Like, hey, we're going to rewild the environment for nature, which again just means we want to control the water and the food. We don't want you out there. We need you in a controlled environment, and we're going to call it nice words. Like sustainability sounds great. Rewilding sounds great. You know, but then again, so does equal pay for all, but it murdered tens of millions of people in Russia. You know, all of these things sound great, but they result in mass murder every time, you know? So this is where we're at, which is why I say my focus is to always tell people to focus on your city, because you can save your city and other people can save their city. You by default save your nation and your society. But this 2030 stuff is at the city level. So you have to gut out your 2030 legislation. And the formula to find it is actually quite easy. It wasn't easy to figure out, but once I figured it out, it's very easy. It's your city 2030 sustainable development. So in this case, it's most likely going to be Preston 2030 sustainable development or Manchester 2030 sustainable development. That's it. Find that, find the people who put it in, get it repealed, and you'll get your cars back. You'll get much of everything that you care about back. If that stays in by 2030, your city will now be a sub-jurisdiction category of the United Nations, and it won't be part of the United Kingdom in any meaningful sense anymore.
Top tip. Now, social credit score and stuff. My fear is that a lot of people will sleepwalk into this for convenience, because a lot of these things are convenient. And we've just had a comment through on the YouTube from Tony saying cashless society will be one of the biggest turning points. And it meshes in, you know, not using cash, using a barcode in your wrist or whatever it's going to be to pay is very convenient. But I pay for my shopping with cash every week, and I encourage people to do so.
I don't think I've used cash for 2 years.
Well, what you need to do next time you go shopping is go to the cash machine, draw out 100 quid in cash.
I don't think I know my PIN number anymore.
And pay with cash. Otherwise, we will lose it. And
but it's dirty and full of viruses, isn't it?
Yeah, no, it's not. No, it's fine.
Cleaned it.
And it's part of your freedom.
Viruses exist. Yeah. So, I think the cash thing, of course, is critical. So the cashless society is a subcategory of the social credit system, because the social credit system, you can think of it as the governing principle of the cashless society. So it's the social credit system that will dictate, of course, whether you can or cannot get served. Again, it goes back to the ESG, which expands more into the individual level. So by blocking that, even if they brought in a cashless society, it has no teeth, because you've banned the social credit system from being able to be used. So they can't say, oh, you said something mean about LGBT or whatever issue it is, or women's rights, or sustainable development, or COVID, whatever, pick any issue, it doesn't matter. They won't be able to ban you from using that cashless money if the social credit system isn't in place. I'm still obviously in favor of cash regardless. I'm just saying that the social credit system is the teeth in the cashless society. That's what they're going to use as the control mechanism. Because without it, it would just be what we use now on a bank card. You know, it wouldn't be any different to just putting your bank card in a thing. That's all digital already. It is the change of the system behind it and the governing principle of what will be around that currency is the real issue. So I think we have to focus on, because correct me if I'm wrong, maybe you guys know something I don't, but is there anything in motion politically, like in Westminster, for a digital currency yet? Like, is there a act in motion?
Not at Westminster. It's the Bank of England. announced
the private Bank of England.
The private Bank of England, like the private Federal Reserve.
Private Federal Reserve, national banks, not national.
The private Bank of England are investigating the potential for a central bank digital currency, a Britcoin, if you like. Nice ring to it.
It is, yeah.
Sounds very patriotic, yeah.
Yeah, fuck that. What is the, because this is something that's been coming up recently, the Fed as well. In fact, I think that was last week. Yes, Joe Biden had signed an executive order last week, I think, didn't he, to investigate the potential for electronic, not Fedcoin, yeah, a digital dollar. So, I mean, what's the trap here? What's the trap with a centralized digital currency like this?
Yeah, so it very much ties into the social credit system, right, as we were talking about. I mean, the real trap with digital currency is the same as when you use PayPal or something right now, right? Like, we all know people that have been banned from PayPal, right? You get banned from PayPal because of wrongthink, because you say something about COVID-19 or climate change or whatever. So they ban you from PayPal. And even in America, I know people who've been banned from Wells Fargo, which is an actual bank, not just a digital bank, an actual bank, a real bank with cash, because they're Christian and they talk about gay marriage or abortion. They've been banned from actual banking for those issues.
Well, look what's happened in Canada with the trucker protests. I mean, Trudeau really took it to the next level, didn't he?
He did, yeah. So, that's all coming. And the reality, the way that I look at it is there's always going to be stepping stones in that we have to sort of block, right? And the block from my perspective would be this ESG issue. That is the governing principle behind why cashless is going to work for them. But it's also immediately very helpful to us because it frees up a lot of our own ingenuity, because it allows businesses to get investment who can produce energy, for example, produce food and all these really important things. So the way that I look at it is I try to think of what's the maximum amount of wins we can get from one thing. And from the ESG thing, we can actually get a ton of wins, both on the currency side, as well as the sovereignty side, as well as the social liberty side. So I think there's a lot of good that can come from that. But yeah, we know that if digital currency comes in permanently, we really have no choice then but to use a parallel system of trading. And that's why it's very important to have those networks set up. But I really want us to stop it before it gets to that point.
Mark, you were talking about incentives before, and I don't know if this is tied in, but what are your feelings on universal basic income, and how do you go against that? Essentially, someone saying free money. There's going to be billions of people, millions of people. How many people are there? There's going to be a lot of people going, "Oh, great, free money," and it's coming from these guys, these the WEF or the WIF or the what.
Yeah,
it's going to be difficult to offer them, freedom, which is not valuable to someone who has a desire for money.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, right. So there's incentive via positiva and via negativa. So in this sense, positiva being positive incentive, get money, and then there's negative. And in some people are positively incentivized, some people are negatively incentivized. So really, we have to use both. And in this instance, it's quite easy to use both, right? So if you think about universal basic income, you have to tell them the obvious, which is going to be a pittance, right? It's going to be like the dole, and you're never going to be able to get any of the life quality things you want. You're not going to be able to upgrade your MacBook or upgrade your car or anything with universal basic income. I mean,
you won't have a car, will you?
Own a car. Yeah, exactly. So there's the negativa approach, which is the consequence. Your acceptance of UBI is going to mean you're going to lose your property rights. You're going to lose your ability to own a house, ability to own a car, ability to own a business, ability to travel. Do you think that's really worthwhile for a digital dole?
This is actually that giving up property rights. That is actually going to be a condition of it, isn't it?
Yes. Yeah.
So your property debt will be cancelled, won't it? But you won't own the property. That's
what I suspect. I don't know exactly how they plan to roll that out, but that's what I would suspect, right? Because we've seen, the national debt is just at record levels, unsustainable. National debts across the world are more than GDP of the nations producing now. So there's more debt than the nations actually produce in income. That's not even the personal debt. That's just the national debt, right? And then if you go down to the personal level, it's the same. So I would suspect the same thing that you do, that most likely they're going to say, we'll cancel the debt. But in return, you're only going to get this universal basic income, which means we're not taking your property rights away. You're just not going to be able to buy any property. You're just not going to be able to afford a car or a house. And then, of course, they just erode the property rights by the aggregate of you not being able to access any of it anymore. Does that make sense?
Yeah, you've got another big cohort of people there, though, who are renting now. They don't like landlords. I'm a landlord. They don't like landlords. And if someone came along and said, tell you what, I can cut that rent by 30%. You don't have to deal with these private fat cat landlords. They're going to be like, oh, great. And you're going to give me a basic income? Absolutely. A lot of people are going to be, no one is going to tell me anything is better than this.
Yeah,
It's
and
a
that's the
dream.
unfortunate situation landlords have been in, especially because, of course, they just want to get rid of any property ownership. So that they've put the landlords across the world in the last couple of years in a very difficult situation where they say, we're going to make sure the renters don't really have to pay your rent, but you then accrue the debt and the empty space. So yeah, it's complicated. But you have to just think about it in terms of people just have to see the reality of the situation. At first, yes, it sounds appealing, but you have to say to them, you have to understand you're giving up, give them a checklist, you're giving up all of these things, right? Your ability to travel, you're never going to own a home, you're never going to own a car, you're not even going to be able to go to other countries anymore, you're not going to be able to own a business. Really think it through. So that's the negative. But the positive, of course, is the opposite of that, which you could say, don't you want to own a home? Don't you want to have a business? Don't you want to make more money? Isn't that the point? Isn't that the point of life? Social mobility. You're not going to be able to do any of those things anymore. You're not going to be able to better yourself to get, that nice car, whatever. So those are both incentives that can work. But I would say ultimately, it's all about timing. Things are going to get really bad economically. They're always going to. The whole point of COVID, of course, was to destroy the economy, to make people dependent enough to get to this position. But there is going to be a time frame, I would say this year and next year, where we can act really quickly. And because when you think about it, people are going to be very desperate for fuel, which is expensive. Food prices are up. Their job, the value of the pound, the value of the dollar has gone down. So we're in a good position where the offer from Satan hasn't come in yet, and people will be ready for a real solution. So then we'll be able to come in and say, look, let's produce our own energy again. Fuel prices are going to go down. The value of the pound is going to go up as a currency because we're producing oil. UK could produce enough oil for 50 years easy. It's an oil producing nation. So these are the kinds of, we have to use this now while we have that window, while people are desperate and they need solutions, before Satan comes in and says, here's your UBI and we're taking all your shit. So we have like a year or two window to make this work.
We're starting to see the chinks already, even though, the inflation, the gas prices, the oil, the food shortages haven't even started to kick in yet, but we're already seeing in mainstream media talking about, what about fracking? Shall we, because Quadrilla just pulled out of the Northwest for fracking, and whoa, get on the phone. Maybe we should get them back. Maybe. Do you know what? As a country, it's quite important to have energy security. And it's not just energy. We're just a complete service economy here. We don't produce enough of our own stuff, and we've taken the cheap route. We've farmed out all our manufacturing to sweatshops in the Far East, and during the last 2 years, it showed how flimsy the just-in-time supply chains can be, and what sort of impact it can have on people's everyday lives. So I think there is chinks showing even before the bad stuff's beginning to bite, which is a reason for optimism from my part.
Yeah, we have to exploit any of those chinks, basically. And I think that this window, as the COVID spell has somewhat died off, and like I say, I do think they will be back with another pandemic before they really roll out sustainability. But regardless of all of that, this is really our time. This is our window, right? So that they're starting to see that COVID was overblown. Even many of the media are admitting it to them. Those intentions might not be good, but regardless, people are starting to see. So this is the time while they're desperate, but not so desperate that they'll accept any deal that they're given. Because that's kind of what they're hoping to get them to. They're hoping to get people to such a desperation that they will accept the UBI deal, the social credit system deal. So we have, like, I would say, maybe 18 months of a window, let's say through this year and next year. And a lot we can do in that time, and even just by chopping some of the 2030 legislation and even blocking the ESG stuff puts us years ahead of where we would have been. And then in that, naturally the economy gets better and naturally businesses and get better and the production issue gets better. So that's why it really comes down to that. And if we don't act on it now, it is going to be impossible to act on. My timeline is 2025. I have it on the website, which you can go on the website, America21century.com. I have 2025 as our timeline. And if we don't achieve our withdrawal from these treaties by 2025, I think we might have missed our window.
Still enough time to build a spaceship, 5 years.
Where does the Russia-Ukraine situation play into all this? Is this a glitch, or is this part of the plan? What do you foresee for the future? I mean, we know that Russia and Ukraine combined, they produce something like 25% of the world's wheat, world's barley, 15% roughly of the world's fertilizer. So we know we're going to have food problems. China's stockpiling grain massively.
Right. Yeah, well, so a month before Russia invaded Ukraine, I put up a video on TikTok, but I also put it on Telegram, which are the only two social medias I really use. I am on Facebook. I just don't use it much anymore. And I put up a video a month, so January 27th. And I pointed out that Russia was going to go into Ukraine, which of course happened. And I pointed out that the real consequence was going to be that the West would cut ties with Russia and Russia would go towards China and they would drop the US dollar, which has, of course, happened. Now, the video is still up, pinned on my TikTok profile. You can go watch it. I pointed this out a couple months ago, long before the invasion happened, that this would be the consequence, because that is how the global governance mechanism works. So the reason that many of my predictions, they're not predictions, I just understand the framework. The reason that they're true is because I understand the premise, and the premise is to erode America. America has to come down. America has to go. Because you can't have global governance with America existing, because America is the de facto global governance. If you want to replace that model, America has to be gone. Now, China already is the proxy, the technocratic proxy. They were set up by David Rockefeller and Zbigniew Brzezinski, who was National Security Advisor of Jimmy Carter, Foreign Advisor for Barack Obama, founding member of the Trilateral Commission and the Council on Foreign Relations, good friend of David Rockefeller. So they set up China to be a Western capitalist country, but what they really set it up is a technocracy, which is the system that Agenda 21 is. So China is this hyper-capitalist, centrally controlled state, i.e. technocracy, a technologically controlled, centralist capitalist state. They have obviously a social credit system and many of the things that we're seeing coming in here. They were the model for the lockdowns and everything we did in the last 2 years. So they are the global model that we are supposed to follow. So the reason that I knew a month before Ukraine that they were going to move away from the dollar and Russia and China are going to be pushed together, everything that's happening now, is because China is the leader that has to overtake America. Now that leadership won't be permanent, it will be temporary. Because China is not America in 1950. China is not capable of carrying the world like America could in 1950. America had a very high moral population. It had very high production, very high GDP at the individual level. It was just a powerhouse that couldn't possibly have been stopped unless it was subverted and made itself, destroyed itself, which is what's happened. So China cannot carry the century like America did. But it's not supposed to. China is supposed to just be a proxy. So you could see that China is going to try to take this number one spot as global leader, which we're already seeing all the East go in that direction. And then what will happen is it will just be consolidated globally. Like China is just a middle ground position from America to global governance. I hope that makes sense. Now, the Ukraine situation was just partly natural. They have had a long-standing conflict for a long, long time. So I don't believe that this was purposefully instigated to be such, right? Like they've been doing this for decades, long before the Great Reset existed, so to speak. But the people that control the boundary conditions we talked about before, the people that set parameters, they know that if you move pawn A and pawn B they still know it's their chess game. They still know what the chess game has to be. So in this case, Russia and Ukraine may be authentic, but those that control global affairs push it where they need to go with global affairs. So that's why a month before the invasion and 2 months before the dropping of the dollar, I said that that was going to happen. And now it's happening with Saudi and everything else. So the next phase is the food shortages, which of course were going to happen anyway under the lockdowns. The lockdowns will, of course, most of the economic damage, of course. So that's going to be the next phase. And this sort of realignment of West versus East is going to happen, because then the global controllers, they have two power blocks that they can easily control. That's why they like power blocks. That's why they funded the Soviet Union. Many of the Wall Street bankers, including the Rothschilds, they funded that because two power blocks, West versus East, is much easier to control than 200 nations.
Yeah,
so
same in World War II as well.
Exactly. Yeah, they funded the Nazis, the British, and the Soviets all at the same time. So, and that's why they're pro-EU, but also pro-West. And by West, I really mean the Anglosphere, and then the East. So what we're going to have is like these three power blocks: the West, which is us, the European Franco-German, and then the Eastern Russo-China. But really, those three power blocks will be sort of controlled, of course, by the same people, and China will be the prominent partner as the world goes more Chinese style, which is just technocratic, which is just global governance. So there's going to be a sequence that rolls out here over time, and that's really what it was about. The primary catalyst for this, the primary objective was the destruction of the dollar, which is already happening now.
This is something that I was quite concerned about, and you've not really helped, Mark, because I've been watching for the noises coming out of China and wondering, are they going to go all in? Are they going to go all in with Russia and split the world essentially in half? With Russia, China, Iran, Pakistan, India. India have very strong ties with Russia. We could see India. We could end up with a sort of, rather than an East versus West, we could end up with a North versus South. As far as the sanctions on Russia, it's only, like you say, the Anglosphere. North America, Western Europe, New Zealand, Japan, Australia. Africa hasn't put any sanctions on Russia. South America hasn't put any sanctions. Asia hasn't put any sanctions on Russia.
Right.
So this is very concerning.
Yeah, and of course, China have a lot of infrastructure in Africa and Asia and Australia.
Well, the Belt and Road, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Well, that's the ultimate end game here as far as the conflict. So, on the January video I said about the dropping of the dollar and stuff, which is happening now, I didn't really get to go much into Belt and Road because that's like a later step where we're maybe looking at a couple of years from now. But that's ultimately how global governance will operate from a trade perspective, the Belt and Road Initiative, which has essentially China, Israel, and the EU as the main points, right? They're the main influencer points: China, Israel, European Union. And then, of course, it goes through many other countries. It goes all around Asia, Middle East, all the way Eastern Europe and stuff. But the primary guys driving it are the China, Israel, and EU drivers. And, of course, it usurps the American continent completely, and there's a reason for that. Again, the premise of understanding how Russia and Ukraine was going to roll out is because I understand the premise is to destroy America. It has to be brought down. Now, there's a way that we can turn that to our advantage in this sense, and the way that I'm doing it is actually to withdraw from their treaties as well, because what they're hoping to do is bring America down, but still have to leech off all the resources, right? And that's what the Agenda 2030 thing is. They're like, oh, we want to destroy your currency, destroy your economy, but we still want to keep your land, obviously. So I'm kind of rolling with the punches, and I recommend that everyone take this approach. Think of it like judo: roll with them, don't roll against them. So what I'm doing is going, great, destroy us on the global stage. I'm sick of policing the world. But while we're sinking away, I'm going to fucking chop every bit of your legislation. This is going to end with my boot on your fucking throat. It's only taken me 9 months to have state senators, several congressmen. I'm going to ban your social credit system. Then I'm going to ban your public-private partnerships. Then I'm going to take the land back, the resources back, and the farming back. And if you come back, I will put my boots on your fucking throat. That's what's going to happen.
Well, it goes back to power being held accountably again, doesn't it? Like I said during the whole Brexit thing, I want my politician at the end of my street, ideally somewhere close enough where I can wring him by the neck. I don't want to have to write an email to fucking Brussels to find someone who's a decision maker, who's accountable. And so, yeah,
it's a tough one.
You've got the right end of the stick. It's local power is the key. If you can find your local representative and put your boot on their neck, as you would say, it tends to get things done, doesn't it?
Well, when I say the boot on the neck, I'm really thinking more of the globalists, not so much the local representative. Definitely don't put your boot on the representative's neck. I was thinking more about Klaus Schwab and Bill Gates. Probably should stipulate that in future. Just in case someone's like, hey, I found my local MP. Marc Malone said I should put his boot on his neck. I'm like, oh shit, well, that escalated fast. So definitely don't do that. No violence. No, but the rolling with the punch thing is important. And this is kind of like the Brexit aspect, right? Which is, if we're going to get pushed away, then it's easier for us to take control of the situation as we go away rather than fighting to remain in. And in this kind of bringing down of America, I look at the positives, and the positives are, while we are kind of being cut off from the global stage, that's a benefit, because at the end of the day, we don't have the resources to police the world anymore. We have too much debt. We have too much blood in our hands that we just don't want anymore. We don't want that. So all we need to do is just chop these tentacles, and then we'll be free, and we won't be the police anymore. And then we can just take back control of our land and not be concerned. So I look at the positives of it, because otherwise, if we still had to be the global police and separate from globalism, it'd be very, very difficult to do. But they're pushing us in that direction. So I think we ought to look at the benefit of that. And after the withdrawal from the European Union, the United Kingdom's in the same position. We should look at that as a benefit. Like, the isolationism at this point can be cultivated for your benefit, for sure.
Yeah, that's an interesting point about the world police, because as you mentioned previously, usually if a country or a country's leader decides it doesn't want to trade in dollars, it wants to abandon the petrol dollars, that's usually when the F-16s and the troops start landing, whether it's Gaddafi or Saddam Hussein or whoever it is. So yeah, it will be interesting to see how this plays out, because you've got all this entire military industrial complex which benefits from rubbleizing countries in the far, in the Near East and whatnot. So there's a tension there as well. If America decides to become more, not isolationist, probably the wrong word, but less interventionist when it comes to foreign policy, there's a tension there, because there's a lot of people who benefit from, like Cheney and what's the name of the firm beginning with Halliburton. There's a tension there which would have to be negotiated.
Yeah, it's that part is actually the only thing that I can't really see clearly right now. Of all of the facets we've discussed, I see how they can play out very clearly. The financials, the resource stuff, the trade stuff. But the military one is the only one that I can't quite see clearly. I can't, because of the same reasons, because China do not have the capability to take over America's position as world police. And Russia do, but it's going to take them a long, long time to build that. Like, they have the military capability, but they don't have the infrastructural capability to pull it off right now. So take the combined effort many years to take over what America has been able to do. That part I can't quite see clearly. I would assume that what's most likely going to happen is that they would probably assume this sort of NATO thing into a more formal military, less so than being like America with just a couple of bases in other countries, which is what NATO really is. It is vastly just the American military. Maybe that becomes actually its own military entity, which would be somewhat separate from America's jurisdiction. That could be potentially what would happen.
Yeah, that makes sense. Really sure. Yeah, a massive expansion of the blue helmets. They'll have their own nukes and stuff. Oh, God, man.
Yeah, it's funny you say that, actually, because there was a woman on YouTube who said in September 2019 that they were going to do this coronavirus she predicted COVID in September 2019. And the reason she did is because of the event 201 stuff. So she she was right there when it happened and said, this is what's going to happen. And of course it happened. Her next prediction is actually that China will invade the US. So I thought, well, I mean, her prediction was very spot on last time. So I just don't see how that's really possible because like, you know, I mean, as great as her prediction was before, I game theory that one out. And I think, how is that really possible? Like, they don't really have the military might to invade America. And even if they did, we're all really heavily armed. Like I have like 3 AR-15s in that cupboard right there. Like, so it's like, you know, with about 10,000 rounds of machine gun ammo. Like, so, and I'm like, there's 100 million men like me who are that heavily armed. Like, we're all really especially in like South Dakota. Yeah, everyone's heavily armed here. So it's like, and even if they were to get past the military, they're just going to get shot everywhere. So it's like, I just can't see it happening. But that was what she said. China's going to invade America.
Well, on that note, Mark, is there any thoughts you want to leave us with? Because we've gone past an hour already, and I could talk to you all night about this. If we didn't talk about big tech, censorship, or a million other different things we could have talked about. So, I mean, the website's on the screen, and it'll be in the show notes, America21century.com. But is there any final thoughts you want to leave us with?
Yeah, I guess the most important thing would be go to the site, and on the homepage, there's a button. Says local activism. Click the button, and there's a bit of a guideline there for local activism, both on how to spot this stuff in your legislator, but also like some potential food systems you can set up in this parallel system version. It's basically political activism with parallel society. So go through that. There will be some useful tips. Sign up for the newsletter, and then when I have the proof of concept that I can export over to you guys, I'll send it out in the newsletter. So just wait for activation. And again, no violence, because I know the CIA are probably watching me now. When I say activation, I mean politically. So, but yeah, it's been good to chat to you guys, man. For sure. Let's chat again. We can talk the other stuff next time, for sure.
Cool. It's been a pleasure, Mark. Yeah, we'll sign off for part one. Just stay on the line for us for 2 minutes while we play ourselves out. And like you say, if you're watching, it's there on the screen, America21century.com, or check out the show notes, and you can find Mark's website there and tune in, sign up to the newsletter, do all those great things, and you know, let's put the boots on the proverbial neck, not physical neck of these fuckers.
And not physical.
Yes. All right. We'll see you for part 2 after a short break, an intermission. Sayonara!
Being a good, responsible COVID citizen is something we should all aspire to.
People have got to understand that vaccination is going to be, in the end, your route to liberty.
Putin is Hitler.